The Soul Foundation exists to seriously address one of humanity's biggest questions: unidentified anomalous phenomena. The Soul Forum is a digital platform that extends the critical discussions and research presented at our annual symposium. Welcome to the Soul Forum with our host, Dr. Peter Skafish, cultural anthropologist and co-founder of the Soul Foundation. Dr. Garry Nolan is the Ratchford and Carlota A. Harris Professor of Pathology at Stanford University and Executive Director of the Board of the Soul Foundation. He is internationally recognized for pioneering biomedical technologies such as CyTOF, Codex, and MIBI, has authored over 350 research articles, and founded multiple successful biotechnology companies advancing science and public health.
Hello and welcome to the Soul Forum. We have today a guest I'm very excited to have, a colleague, a friend, and my co-founder at the Soul Foundation, Dr. Garry Nolan, who really needs no introduction when it comes to the UAP subject. So welcome, Garry.
Thanks so much. Actually, it'll be fun to actually be on this. I haven't participated really yet, except
yeah, we haven't done this yet, and we are going to cover a lot of ground today. But I wanted to jump into what's going on at the time of the recording, which is that we are just at the heels of Trump's announcement that he's going to declassify through the Department of Defense not only UAP records, but apparently records that concern, as he put it, extraterrestrial and alien life. And so, everyone's talking about this. People are talking about too much. Expectations are high. I think we should talk about it and what's on your mind about it.
Well, I think, I think the hope is that he just declassifies. I think the wording wasn't the wording just that begin the process of release, which is different than declassify. I know you know that, but it's because there's a lot of lee room in the word begin, or the words begin the process, etc. And is very different than, let's say, a law passed or an executive order put forward, or any of a number of other approaches that could be taken to bring the information out. Because begin the process really implies, well, that there is a process, and that means that you can't just dump a whole bunch of information out. That there are rules, and there are probably things that you don't want released. Or shouldn't be released, methods, et cetera, the things that the Department of Defense always uses to say why they can't let information out, which is real, and it's not, I don't think, an excuse. And so that process, let's say that there is to be disclosure of some kind, there needs to be across the intelligence services and any other agencies that have remit, understanding of what it is that's being released and what the consequences are of such release.
Yeah, and what do you think those consequences are? I mean, there are consequences across different institutions within the government, and then there are broader social, scientific, et cetera, consequences.
Well, there's everything, as we know, from religious. I mean, the Rand Corporation has done, prior analyses of this and other groups. I think the biggest one today is, well, first of all, are we alone? And that would be just the admittance of that, the open admittance of that, is frankly going to be enough to change how we view ourselves in the context of the universe. And getting the government to say that such is the case, absent even providing evidence, let's say, for it, would be a game changer. Now, we heard former President Obama say as much, and then he pulled it back a few days later. The why of it, I don't quite understand. He would have said it in the first place, knowing the consequence of what it was that he was saying. Whether that triggered President Trump's statement to Ducey at the time. I think it was on the plane. Was it on one of the planes? that there was that was breaking classification. That was almost kind of a weird tell, and people took it as such. But then he went, he said, "Well, I'll maybe help President Obama in this, and maybe I'll declassify things." But then the Truth Social that he made was not a declassification per se, but I think it was. I think that probably people, let's say behind the scenes, came to him and said, "Well, look, this is a process, President Trump. So maybe we should talk about it as a process." And then once the process has been formalized, then there might be ways to declassify things, such as you said on the plane. And that would be how I would start with it, because there's everything from economic to religious to social reasons. But as I've often said when asked about what would be the consequences of disclosure for the common folk, is they might turn their head for a day or two, but then they are going to go back to looking at kitchen table and what's going to put bread on their table or keep their families safe, just in economic terms, not in existential terms.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think something we should make sure people understand, because it underscores the point you just made, which is that people will listen to this and maybe shrug their shoulders and go back to everyday life. Is that I think a lot of people don't understand that two presidents just played out for the entire world to see something that I think you and I both know for a fact to be true, which is that that there are components of federal government that know very well about this, and that to some extent the efforts and programs to deal with it are under presidential authority, and presidents do get briefed to some extent. And Trump's statement, that's classified information. He wasn't supposed to share that. Pretty much exposed the matter. And yet, despite some reporting, we haven't seen serious journalists or many media people really pursue the meaning of that.
Right. And I guess that's because at one level, it's really, unfortunately, not that much different than what's gone before so far. But I do, though, think that it puts a little bit of pressure, or at least it gives people I don't like to use the word hammer, but a reason to push others within the government to say, hey, look, the president said this. I think you should, next time we come up for a vote, you should do something. Or it might, let's say unwittingly, cause not necessarily a whistleblower, but somebody else at some level of government to interpret what was just said as a reason to release information. Say, okay, well, look, the president said we had to begin the process. I'm just part of a process. I think I've been given permission. And so, there might be an unexpected. I doubt that very much that will happen. I think people are savvier than that. But I do think, though, that it opens up an opportunity for us to say, okay, well, from the highest level of government, there is at least the permission to start. And frankly, I think that that's really all the Soul Foundation, you or I or others have wanted, is to say that there's a reason to look into the data, because the data seems to suggest that there's something there, or at least there continues to be a reason to ask questions. And so certainly for the debunkers out there who want to say that it's a nothing burger, well, that couldn't be further from the truth. It really is. I think it's fuel to continue. At least it gives me fuel to continue.
Yeah. So let's turn to your views about this as a scientist. And I think, because we have an audience here that doesn't always delve deeply into the UAP subject, I think it's important to have a conversation with you here about what this means to you as a scientist, because that's where your real fire is and your real passion is, even when you're involved in the attempt to create reform on this in government. and you've been thinking about this in one way, shape, or form your entire life, I think, or mostly since I think childhood. So I know you have pretty considered views about it. What's your current perspective on the different hypotheses and that the data favors, and how you think people should explore them?
So, I mean, for me, I mean, I can go back to, let's say, at least 2008, where I started, let's say, re-exploring some issues that I had dealt with as a young boy, things that I'd seen and often wondered about. And, it started really around 2008, 2009, when I started looking, let's say, online at the events that other people were observing. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of that yet. I started to realize that other people were seeing and observing the same things that I had, or were thinking about it at least in the same way. That, okay, well, there seems to be incidents that were similar to the things that either I had seen, or even new things that I hadn't understood anything about, which to me at least added up to an idea that there was something else here. And the first thing that at least I locked in on as a biologist, a geneticist, et cetera, was the supposed similarity of form, the humanoid form that was being observed. And that to me didn't play well against the idea that these were extraterrestrial, that they came from another planet and yet looked like us in one manner or another, because that just felt wrong to me. As a geneticist, I could see no more reason that they would have look like us than they might look like a rutabaga. There's just no particular, I think, reason that makes this form ideal as the vessel for intelligence. And so, I think one of the first things that I came to was, well, they look enough like us. Maybe they are, and I'd always considered at least two things. Maybe they were an alternative branch of humanity that went on separately and earlier than we did for whatever reason, or let's say go back as far as the dinosaurs, that something had evolved as far back as then, and had become, intelligent, maybe gone elsewhere in the galaxy and decided to come back home and see what had been happening, back on the old homestead. Or, that they were future humans. And Professor Mike McMaster's has written about this extensively as well, that had come back. And that they were coming back to check on their forebears, to sort of do an anthropologic study of who and what we were. And so those were the three things that I had had in my mind. And for whatever reason, when I first came across Jacques Vallée, in fact, he and I had lunch at our first meeting at a place called the Rosewood down the way. At that point in time, I had made the fatal mistake of becoming convinced that it was future humans. That was because it just added up to me. And Jacques very quickly disabused me of the many reasons why I was wrong. And that was the first time I thought, oh, I really like this guy, because he showed me why I was wrong, and showed me a wider view of the world, of what it might be. And since I had not at that point read any of his works, he explained it in brief, but the way that he explained, or at least I came to know later without going into that particular discussion, was, well, maybe this is all some kind of a show, some kind of a set of avatars put in place for our, not entertainment, but as intermediaries through which we explore the other. That there is another, but it is so ephemeral and so beyond understanding that the only way that it can represent itself is by showing itself as not human, but sufficiently similar to what it is that we might want to interface with, that we don't go run screaming for the hills because it comes out with a fang-dripping tentacles, slobbering. We're gonna eat you and your children. And so it's that kind of openness that, in fact, even got Jacques in trouble in the early days when he said that these might be interdimensionals, or that these might be, just as I said, some sort of interface, a puppetry, or as he would often call it, a puppet show, kabuki theater, that it's not what you see, but it's the meaning behind what you see. It's, can you see this not as what it seems to be at face value, but that it represents something. But Jacques, of course, went a step further than this, which is to say that the manners in which it is done and the patterning of the timing of how it's done actually represents almost a kind of super system, a system of systems that is meant to corral and not control in the, let's say, in a Machiavellian sense, but to point us in certain ways, to open our minds, and in the best possible way. I mean, assuming, let's say, the best possible interpretation is that you don't tell your children necessarily what it is that they should do. You let them make mistakes to learn, because that's the best. Reinforcement learning is a far better way to learn than to simply be told what to do. And so it was sort of a reinforcement entrainment that he was pushing. And this, of course, made him an outlaw in the UFO community, at least for a while. But now everybody, in retrospect, realizes that if anything, it is that larger picture of how to interpret it that is the most scientific, because it encompasses almost all of the downstream possibilities, many of which, for instance, Carl Nell has elaborated upon, or others have elaborated upon: interdimensionals, Hal Puthoff's, ultra-terrestrials, etc. All these different kinds of ideas. And so I think that that's the best way to look at it as a scientist, is to say it falls within these many domains. We have evidence that it's this, or evidence that it's that, but we don't have a summary theory that completes the entirety of it, unless you go to Jacques' meta theory. That, that Jacques' meta theory says that it's all of these things, but that it depends upon the circumstance and how it wants to represent itself, because it's doing many things at many times, which would require, of course, a consciousness and a level of control, as Jacques would often put it, that it implies that it could take a hold of a volume of space and manipulate it to its will.
Well, and so it's interesting you put that on the table, because at once, what's interesting about Jacques' theory, it's called, I think we can call it the control system theory.
Control system,
which is basically the idea that whatever it's doing, it's a kind of conditioning regime in the behaviorist sense, and that it has a pedagogical or educative function. And as you said, it would ultimately attempt to try to entrain human beings to act or think in a certain way, but it would give them some kind of autonomy in making the choice to learn, or to learn through error. So that theory, the control system theory, as you said, it may be the only proper theory we have, in the sense that it can encompass seemingly contradictory or divergent data. But on the other hand, it's a strong theory. And when people stick with the theory, they sometimes lose the pools of data.
Right.
So my question, for you is, you have immense, and I know this for a fact, it's not rhetoric, you have immense scientific curiosity about the different kinds of data. We can talk about it later, but you will get on a plane and go somewhere and go to a remote location. And I've seen you do it many times, just to gather data firsthand. What right now are the most compelling, the most intriguing kinds of data? And are you forming new hypotheses and even the beginning of a theory on the basis of those?
So, I often distinguish between anecdotes and replicable science. Anecdotes are points in time, stories, which are evidence. They're usually experiential for an individual. And you can either believe them or not, but at least from the point of view of the person who experienced it, it was true. And then there are artifacts left behind. And there's three kinds of artifacts that people talk about. There are effects on people or the environment or trees or animals nearby. So evidence of perturbation. In science, we call it perturbation. So there's been a perturbation either read out through X-rays on an individual, burns, apparent skin samples taken, or wounds on the skin. Or in the case of a recent study that Jacques had done, bark burned in the middle of the forest at a place where a nuclear physicist saw an extremely bright light that they estimated the light energy to be, extraordinary. So those are two kinds of evidences, or like there supposedly was a craft that landed, and then there are depressions in the ground. So there was an object there that, and the depressions are not obviously footprints or anything normally made. Okay, so those are sort of secondary bits of evidence. They're perturbations that you weren't there to see them, but they had an effect on something that at least transiently you can still take pictures of or understand. So that's one kind of bit of evidence. The other might be then materials left behind. And so that has been at least very much part of my initial focus, which has been materials left behind, metals of, that some people would call slag, but some of the pieces of metals that clearly look structured, the so-called bismuth magnesium pieces of the arts parts, etc., and or pure metals that I've had access to and that others have had access to that have altered isotope ratios that are clearly manufactured, that they are not. To say that they are not of this earth implies that they're from no other place than Earth, but there are ways that you can, in human terms, manufacture them. But often these pieces, at least some of the ones that I've had access to, were found at a time when the industrial capability of our society was not capable of accomplishing the feat. Or at least if they were, it would be at such extraordinary cost, there's no good reason why that we would do it, nor a good reason why you might leave it on the beach on a fancy beach in Brazil. We can talk about that object later. So that's another kind of evidence that I've actually had access to several of those kinds of pieces and analyzed. And then the third one is purely biological, right? The claims that there are bodies. Now, I've never seen any of these. I would love to, believe me, but I've never. And because that to me as a biologist would be the holy grail of understanding, okay, well, what are alternative? I mean, if you could look at a body and let's say the physiology of that body, the organs within it, et cetera, I would expect to see something which is as frankly chaotically designed as humans are. I mean, our systems work, but they're basically kludge upon fix, with rubber gum and everything, as evolution took prior functions and turned them into new things because mistakes were allowed to be made that ended up being providential for the organism. But we ended up, let's say, being led down an evolutionary hole where we're stuck with what we got. But you can imagine, and this is what today's so-called synthetic biologists are trying to do, is to say, okay, if we could redesign ourselves in the best possible way, in the most efficient way, we might, first of all, get rid of the appendix, formally by gene editing it out, or get rid of certain holes in our immune system that would allow, for instance, certain kinds of viruses to spread more readily. Or we might say, hey, you know what, the lung and the heart, we're spending a lot of time moving blood to and from the two. Why don't we just combine them? We have a stomach that is separate from, this and that because, in the digestive tract. Well, if we could feed ourselves the right kinds of food, maybe we could simplify the digestive tract, et cetera. So, you might decide, for instance, that if you're going to live in space, there are certain attributes of the human body that we already know are wrong for living in zero G. I mean, we know that's what happens to astronauts when they go. They have problems later with their eyes. They lose bone density, they lose muscle mass, et cetera. So there are probably compensatory changes that you might synthetically alter if humans wanted to live in a different place. So we don't have that level of knowledge base yet to accomplish it. But you can imagine that a more advanced civilization would, so that if they were to come here, and they were to come here knowing that they would be living in such environments, they might do two things at once. One, look enough like us so that we wouldn't run screaming for the hills. But two, adapt themselves in ways that allow them to live across multiple ecologic zones.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So you just sent my mind running in many directions at once. Here's a simple question. I don't want to digress too much about this, but one of the challenges synthetic biology would face in kind of re-engineering, redesigning the human body would be you would have to do this iteratively across many generations, correct?
I mean,
at the level you're talking about, where you would be redesigning organs and yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's because we're still learning, and iteration usually implies trial and error, which is learning. But I mean, look at the company, I think it's called Mammoth, or I forget the other one. It was by George Church, where they literally they've resurrected at least the visual format of a dire wolf, a wolf that came from, many tens of centuries ago, by using the genetic code from mummified dire wolves, or the woolly mammoth. The first woolly mammoth has been born. Now, is it really a woolly mammoth? No, it doesn't have all the capabilities to live in the Arctic yet. I would question that they've done all of that yet. But to your point of iteration, but with sufficient knowledge before even starting, one might have sufficient command of genetics and metabolism and biology to ordain what it is that you want, and then reverse engineer and not even have to do trial and error. Just print it, just have it happen. Or design an egg that became it, in whatever form of growth tank they want to utilize. But that would require a level of super intelligence that at least today we don't have. But surprisingly, with the advances that AI are making even today, we don't even know within 10 years if we might not even have, or not we, but the AIs that we create might not even have such a thing. So it's then very easy to take yourself aside and say, okay, well, let's say there was a civilization that arose 100 million years before we did elsewhere in the nearby galaxy. It wouldn't be hard for us to imagine that they had achieved that level of super intelligence, not personally themselves, but through their AI, that their AI would be able to come here and do everything that Jacques is saying that they seem to be capable of doing. Which is why I always am confused by scientists who get up and say, well, there's no way for them to get here. Well, who says that the thing that was launched is the same as what it was that got printed on the other side when it arrived here 100,000 years later, even at 0.1 the speed of light? I just don't. I don't understand that, because I don't ever think, for instance, that me getting on a ship means that I need to be the thing on the other side that gets off. I'd be just as happy to design an AI that would print, my progeny on the other side, even if it had to do it from raw chemicals.
Well, and what's also interesting about that is that about that objection is that it presumes that our science, our technology, our ontology, even about the universe, all those things are going to be unrevised, not transformed in the future. And yet, if you're discussing even just speculatively or hypothetically extraterrestrials, you might have to presume that they would be further along in science and their understanding of reality. I mean, it doesn't make sense as a kind of coverall objection. It certainly does from the perspective of science today to say I can't investigate X, Y, or Z because I would have no, you could make that objection then, but it doesn't make sense if you extrapolate out, if you move out from science and you say, well, we can't just evaluate those proposals through data and through science. But coming back to science, I think you're pointing out you have many reasons to not just take UAP seriously, but to take seriously the prospect that they can be investigated scientifically. You laid out three kinds of data: perturbations to living and non-living things, metals and materials that appear that at least allegedly come from UAP events, and I think we can be pretty sure they do in many cases, but also other anomalous metals, and then apparent biological specimens,
right?
Left
Alleged
behind
bodies,
alleged.
And in the material sense, I mean, all of the things that I have, apart from the arts parts piece that we've been involved in developing, seem to be effluvia, things left over, some sort of exhaust or industrial byproduct, rather than the machine itself. Now, I'd be interested in the machine itself, because the so-called effluvia, as I call it, or the leftover, like some of the metals, they are indicative of a process that I have to guess at why that would be the downstream product. I'm making the assumption that there was some utility or some machine that took something else and ended up making that, but that was the leftover. But it was for the purpose of doing some other function. So my main interest is first showing that it's anomalous, and then putting that data out and to the world at large and saying, why do you think this? How would this happen? I mean, let's turn more specifically then to the Ubatuba part that I've been involved with.
And before you jump into that, what is the Ubatuba?
So the Ubatuba was an event in Ubatuba, Mexico, in the late supposed 1950s, but some stories seem to put it even earlier, where supposedly a fisherman had seen a UFO of some kind, and the story changes depending on whose origin that you listen to. But an object was seen that either dropped something, was glowing. It either dropped something and then or it itself exploded and left metal scattered across the beach and in the water. And supposedly this fisherman picked it up or called somebody, and somebody came and picked it up. And I haven't been able to really trace down the reality of that. But at one way or another, this metal ended up in the hands of a reporter in Brazil. And that individual had some of it analyzed by scientists locally, and then sent that pieces of it off in different directions to either a museum in Argentina or ended up in some places in the United States. And when I came across it, and when Jacques had given me a piece of the material, it was claimed to be magnesium, pure, nearly pure magnesium. And the stories were all that this is pure magnesium. And so, and then others such as Robert Powell and Michael Swords had done analysis on it, on the material that they had, at least the chain of custody that they had, validating that it was nearly pure magnesium, which isn't hard to make, but it sort of leaves open the question of why would you have pure magnesium? It's not useful as a material you would use from a materials resilience standpoint, because if you set it on fire, if you heat it up to a certain point, it'll actually, explode. But then the piece that I got was unusual because it didn't, to me, look like magnesium. I mean, I took it at face value that somebody said it was magnesium, but it had a kind of shiny silver blue aspect to it. And my mind went back to my chemistry class back in high school. And my chemistry teacher at the time was a guy by the name of Dr. Spencer. And Dr. Spencer had actually worked on the Manhattan Project. And it was a private school. And so it was just me and one other student in this advanced chemistry class. And he brought in a piece of magnesium and showed how he could light it on fire and it wouldn't stop unless he put it in a kind of oil that would snuff it out and wouldn't itself catch on fire. And so, but even before he did that, he showed us it, and it had kind of a dusty coating, an oxide. And so I remembered that all the way back from chemistry. And so when I saw this kind of bluish metal, I thought that doesn't look like it. But I just, again, took it at face value and didn't really think too much about it, saying I probably don't know very much about what it could be. So Jacques and I put this in an instrument called a secondary ion mass spec, a kind of instrument at Stanford that is super sensitive, so sensitive that you can separate out not only different isotopes by their mass, but actually it was sufficiently sensitive that you could separate out a chromium isotope that is almost exactly the same weight as an iron isotope by the third or fourth decimal points weight. And it's called a magnetic sector mass spectrometer. And what's great about this instrument is that it's so ultra sensitive, but what's not great about it is that it is, you can only measure 8 or 9 things at a time. So you had to decide ahead of time what it is that you wanted to look at. And it took a lot of time to maneuver the detectors along the track so that they'd be at the right position, so that when the magnetic sector changed the arc of the masses, it would hit the right detector at the right time. So we set it up for, because we actually had multiple different samples in our chamber, we set it up for magnesium, for the Ubatuba, and we set it up for iron and chromium and titanium for these other pieces that we had for the Council Bluffs and a few other things that Jacques had. So we tried to do it all at once because actually it was expensive. It was going to be a $5,000 experiment to do this, and I was taking it out of my endowed funds, which I was allowed to do. What was interesting was that 2 pieces of that we had 4 pieces of the Ubatuba in there because we wanted to be able to do it in a, let's say, a statistically valid way, and 3 is sort of the minimum you need to do. 4 is a bit better. You'd love to have done 10 fragments, or 100 different fragments, but it's a mildly destructive process, but you're taking off literally nanometers of material. For all intents and purposes, nobody would know that you'd done anything to it, but it still takes time and effort. And so we'd focused it on the magnesium, and 2 pieces from one of the samples, Moisture A or Moisture B, which people will recognize as being, I think that's Brazilian. I think that, or maybe that's Spanish, because this was from the Argentinian Museum. The pieces that I had were from the Argentinian Museum. And so, as opposed to the pieces that the Michael Swords and Robert Powell had, which were from a different chain of evidence, which were shown to be at magnesium. So we looked at magnesium, and lo and behold, we saw magnesium there. But that two of the samples had magnesium at the ratio, they had magnesium isotopes, 24, 25, 26, at exactly the ratios you would expect to see on Earth. Two of the other samples from, let's say, moisture B, sample B, moisture means sample, more or less, had identically different ratios that were different from normal, so far off as to be statistically improbable that it would have been a mistake. And even more so statistically improbable that they were all on the same chip, measured at the same time in the same instrument. And so, not likely that there were an instrument error going on here. So, fast forward a few years, and I talked about this publicly, then I did a different analysis. We did something called atomic probe tomography. Atomic probe tomography works by literally eating into the sample atom by atom, and you get a relative position of where that atom is within about 5 angstroms. And it's a very, very common technique. It's been around for 40, 50 years. It's technically very difficult to do. Each of those samples for me to do cost me $5,000. And so, in total, I did about 10. So that was $50,000 worth of effort. But what you get is an atomic map of where each of the atoms are. You get about 50% of the sample of the atoms that are in the sample, which is extraordinary, and their relative position within 5 angstroms. So just to give people a sense of what that distance means. The standard interatomic distance between 2 atoms, let's say in a carbon-carbon bond, is a little less than an angstrom. And so if you have something which you're only measuring within about 5 angstrom distance, let's say you had 6 carbon atoms in a ring, that would be graphene or benzene, depending upon what it is that's attached to it nearby. If you were to randomize those within 5 angstroms, you would just get a little cloud of atoms. You wouldn't really know what its exact positioning was, but it's still good enough. But the first thing that came across from that analysis was it was silicon. In fact, it was 99.99% silicon.
And to make sure everybody follows, this is this very sample from Ubatuba that you had simply assumed because you were told that this was the case was just pure magnesium.
Exactly. And so I thought, somebody's made a mistake here. There was magnesium in the sample.
And you had only looked for magnesium because, yeah.
Right. But it was at such a very low concentration. And because this instrument that I used originally, the SIMS, nanosims made by Kamika, was so highly sensitive, we were able to pick it up because we were looking for it. It's kind of like if you go looking for something, you'll only see it. But if you don't look for something that might be there, you'll miss it.
And I'm sure this is one of those mistakes that you just thought, like, as a scientist, like, okay, why did I just take on trust what someone said about data?
Exactly. But, I look at Robert Powell's and their results and I go, well, why wouldn't I? But then if I put it together with this sort of incongruence of, well, it was kind of bluish metal, shiny metal. And I knew from my first ever real chemistry class that it should have been, a dusty oxide on the surface. So anyway, that incongruity, came back to haunt me. So I talked about the fact that it was silicon publicly at one point, and then I got a note from Robert Powell saying, Gary, I think you made a mistake. We checked it out and it's magnesium, and here's our paper. And, I looked at their paper and there was zero wrong with it. And I sent him my data, and he can't find anything wrong with the data. It's just the data. So you have to come to one of at least two conclusions. There were either two metals on that beach, which ended up being two different chains of custody, one of which ended up in Argentina and the other which ended up in the hands of this reporter. But interesting, one of the moisture samples came through this supposedly same reporter and was sent to the Argentinian group. And then one of the other samples came through another one. So the same reporter apparently had access to both of these metals, one of which ended up in one chain of custody and analysis, which said, hey, this is magnesium. The other which ended up in moisture in the other hands. Now, I was talking with some scientists over in the engineering department about our results and the silicon results and saying, and the magnesium results. And they had looked originally at the magnesium results and said, well, there's something interesting about these magnesium results in that if you look at the changes that have occurred, the 24, 25, and 26 in what should be normal, the ratios have all been shifted up one. They've all gone from 24, the 24 has become 25, and 25 has become 26. So 24 is supposed to be about 80%. 25 is supposed to be about 9, and the other is supposed to be at 11, more or less. Everything got shifted one over, and meaning like, okay, there's been, so how you could do that one of two ways. One way you can do it is you can just purify the elements, the isotopes, which you can do. You're about perhaps to go to war with Iran over nuclear enrichment of isotopes, and then mix them back together in this ratio. But the why of why you would do it is there's no good reason to do it.
And if I'm correct about this, there's no record of industrial processes that have been used to do that.
Okay. No. I mean, you could do it, but there's no reason to do it. So, and it's, at least at the time that this was found, it would have been very expensive to do, especially in the gram levels. Mature. And so these researchers said, well, there's another way that it can be done. And that's exposing the material to heavy neutron bombardment. What's neutron bombardment? Well, the difference between 24, 25, and 26 of magnesium is that they have an additional neutron. 25 has the same number of protons, has an additional neutron. They have the same electronic configuration, the same, basically, whatever the functionality of the nucleus is more or less the same, with some spin component differences, how they behave in electromagnetic fields. But so what this postdoc did in this guy's lab was he said, well, let's calculate how much exposure would be required to get this difference. And so what you do is you do something which is called a cross-sectional analysis of what is the shape of the nucleus, and what is known about the bombardment characteristics of what's required to get a neutron forced into a nucleus. So they came up with a number and showed that, in fact, uniform exposure of pure magnesium to the following amount of radiation would give you exactly the ratio that you saw. So it wasn't, what it was saying was the ratios that we saw were not random.
Yeah, when you first told me this, my mind was pretty blown by that.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure you were ready to talk about that publicly today, so I'm glad you brought it up. What you told me at the time was, and I think I'm about to say something you were about to say, is it's not just random, it corresponds to a physical principle.
Yeah. So that you can hypothesize that the material was exposed to neutrons for some period of time, sufficient to get that change. And the amount of neutron exposure was not trivial to accomplish that. So then I thought, gee, well, what about the silicon? Because silicon actually has isotopes as well. Actually, 3 isotopes of silicon, 28, 29, and 30. 27 is aluminum, so which has only a single isotope, stable. There's a semi-stable version, but it has a half-life of a few thousand years. And so essentially there's none of that around. The only place you find it is in outer space where it gets exposed to gamma particles. And so I went back and looked at the ratios of the silicon that I had sitting in my data bank for 3 years. And I about wanted to kill myself because the ratios of the silicon were way off. And I was like, Garry, why didn't you even look? You didn't even look, Garry, at the data that was sitting in front of you and see that the silicon ratios are way off. And not like trivially off, again, way off. So I gave them and again, in the same way, that the lower one was converted to the next one up, the next one was converted to the next one up. And so I told the postdoc, here's the same. And he had developed this, all these complex equations to do this computation. We've actually written a little paper about it that we're going to be putting forward at some point. And lo and behold, within a factor of like 2 or 3, the same level of radiation of neutron bombardment capable of converting the magnesium was what would be required to convert the silicon to the ratios that we saw.
Okay, this I didn't know. So it's actually it's the same intensity of radiation.
Correct. And it's like you either let it sit in a nuclear reactor for 10,000 years, or you expose it to a neutron beam of such high levels of that we don't even have them. Okay, so
describe that mathematically. When you told me about that, you said it was just it was a tremendous energy requirement.
Yeah, I'll have to go and find the maybe during a break in this, I'll go and find it and we can come back to it and I can show you the actual picture. So inordinate levels of neutron radiation would be required. Okay, so that's, I put that as a preliminary result because now I'm going back and looking at my data and saying, and asking myself, what could I have done wrong in computing these ratios? Is there any systematic error in what it is that I've done, before I dare publish a paper? And this, I want to use this as a pivot point just momentarily to say, scientists are the original skeptics. Scientists, by definition, are skeptics. We don't come to the table asking or saying, I want to prove this. I come to the table asking, what is this? And what can explain this? Debunkers are the people who are the original unscientists that come to the table wanting to prove something ahead of time. They're the people who are doctrinaire. They're the people who, let's say, as we were discussing the other day, they're coming at it with an orthodoxy, or let's say a priesthood, but without the benefit of the training that priests go through for years and decades to at least have some sociologic or spiritual understanding of why they're coming to this belief system that they have. So, I want to double check. And I luckily have enough of the material that I can hand it to 10 other labs to say, would you just go ahead and check the isotope ratios for me to make sure that I didn't make some sort of systematic error? Maybe the atomic probe tomographer is measuring something in a way that's different than another kind of mass spectrometer should. And, it's relatively easy for me to do that. It's finding the time, finding the money, trying to decide where in the status of what needs to be done, both in my day job and let's say my side job here, which is certainly more than a hobby, of, what does it take to get it done? And so, I'm pretty sure of the results, but being sure is not something that yet I can do where I can hand it to another person. Well, I can hand it to other people, and I'm going to, but again, I need to get these postdocs on board to say, okay, are you ready to put your name on this? And actually they've said yes. So it's not like they're afraid. But I can't just go and do it without their say so, because frankly, it was their idea, not mine. I mean, I'm just the purveyor of the result, not the originator of the reason why. But the reason why I bring this up is because why it's so important to get data like this out, like I did with the Council Bluffs, is when you put data out there and you ask and you say, here's the data, how it's collected. We're pretty sure we collected it the right way. What you're offering up is the opportunity for other people to step in and give reasons why the data is the way it is. So, and that's the best way that, let's say, open source science is done. And that's actually the way that, academics usually operate, is they put a result out. Somebody says, I don't believe, here's another way of looking at it. Here's another set of equations that you should have applied, and so you have the normal academic discourse, hopefully without too much throwing of dishes. And
okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't say that if you guys are correct about this, this is a really remarkable finding. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we end up being correct, it would be extraordinary.
Yeah, it totally extraordinary, because I mean, what you're saying in essence, and I'm saying this for the benefit of the audience, who I think has mostly tracked, but they'll have missed some pieces here, and I certainly have as a non-scientist. I'm a humanities, social sciences person. Is that it would be very difficult to explain the isotope ratios you found both in the magnesium and the silicon samples if there wasn't this exploitation of a physical principle that by which using that as reference, you would be bombarding these metals with high intensity neutrino radiation, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And it would be just and you would have no explanation for why this would naturally occur otherwise.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
There's the only other way to get the ratios are to purify them into their individual ratios and then mix them together at the ratios that we found. But why would you mix them together first of all, why would you mix them together at a different ratio anyway? So that's like question number one. And question number two is, why would you mix them at the ratio that could be explained by neutron bombardment? That some professor 30 or 60 years later would figure out.
Right. That would be very, very odd, as you.
It's odd. It's odd,
yeah.
And it's it's worthy of.
Well, and let's rule that out, because that doesn't make sense as an explanation. The latter one. So here's a first question, and this is going to sound a little off the wall, maybe initially, but I think I'm on the right track with this. Is if, let's say, once this is published, you have a sufficient number of people who replicate the results, or they find similar results with other materials, that would transform this little corner of science, or this little method in science that I think is called materials characterization, to assume that there may be materials available for analysis that are not simply artifacts of nature. They're also artifacts of artifice, of design,
right,
of technology. And you don't have to say anything about the origins or who did it. You're simply saying someone did it. Right. And it's unlikely to be us, because we don't have the techniques.
Correct. Exactly. And so that's it's about as close to proof as you're going to get. The only other proof that I would, let's say, feel comfortable with is a different kind of material, where the organization of the atoms is at such a level of complexity and bonding structures that nobody on Earth could explain the complexity. And I mean, I use, for example, life as an example of the ultimate machine. Every atom in every molecule of every piece of a protein is so redundantly multifunctional that nothing short of either a superintelligence or evolution, which can achieve superintelligence levels of complexity. Witness Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene, as an example, or The Blind Watchmaker. Both of his books are extraordinary if you want to get into this area and think about it. Is you can achieve seemingly intelligent design simply via evolution and trial and error. But that would be hard. That level of complexity would be hard to replicate in materials design, because that would assume living material that had the ability to reproduce itself. Or it would assume that somebody knows enough about how to make something so complex that it could be functional in a level that we don't. And the step back of this would be, humans eventually understood in materials design the notion of put this material next to this material next to this material, and now you've got a diode or a transistor. This is a resistor. These two pieces of metal close to each other are a capacitor and can hold a charge. Put these things all together and you've got a radio or a computer. And so from the days that I was a student or I was a kid going around I was a paper boy, on Thursdays would be trash day. And I would note people would have their television sets thrown away. I would take the television set home and I would take all the pieces out of the circuit boards because I thought they were cool, capacitors and all the rest. But I mean, that was back when we had vacuum tubes, which were essentially transistors. But we've shrunk, and every era has shrunk them down to literally nanometer size, near atom level interactions. And 1 nanometer is 10 angstroms. 1 angstrom, if I said, is basically the distance between 2 atoms. So our electronics have gotten down to near atomic resolution. But what we still do is we mostly still think in terms of modularity. This is a transistor, that's a resistor, there's a capacitor, or 10 other functions. I mean, it's gone much further than just those simple ideas. All kinds of other ideas of qubits, et cetera, and ghostly particles that are more like wave functions than the kind of modular thinking. But now imagine that, again, go a million years ahead where you've got a superintelligence, which is an AI, or a biological being which has used AI to upgrade itself, basically make its own intelligence greater, so that it could keep up with its own AI. And now you can start to think that it would make materials that were multifunctional and made at almost the same level of complexity as biology. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, my goal has been in like the last few years to build an instrument, and we're almost finished with it, that will be able to take apart nearly any material at the atomic level with near angstrom level resolution, such that we can say, well, I mean, it has a great utility for my biology work that I want to do, because I want to look at the 3D structure of DNA. I think that's where the real code is. But it could also be used for looking at some material that somebody might have, which is made at a level of complexity that if you were just to use today's random techniques, you just say, oh, there's this much carbon, this much this in it, as opposed to here's where this is, here's where that is, here's where this was, here's the bonding structure. And then you put the whole thing together and you say, well, this is unlike anything we've ever seen. And, unlike anything we've ever seen, you immediately have to say, well, is there any natural process that would create it? That's the first question you would ask. The second question you would ask, if you could, reasonably state that all of those things were off the table, natural, is, okay, what would it do if I had these here, these here, these here? So then you would, and that's the other reason for sort of the open sourcing of it. That's the reason why you would say, okay, well, here's what it is. I'm not, and I'm often, people are accused me of saying, well, Gary's not a metallurgist. How dare he, do metallurgy? Well, I'm not. I'm just telling you what's there and putting it out into the world and saying, okay, well, you tell me. And had I not done that, for instance, with the magnesium ratios, I wouldn't have had these people come to me and say, hey, you could explain these magnesium ratios by neutron bombardment. Oh, and by the way, you didn't even know it, but you actually were measuring silicon at the same time in this, or in fact, you were measuring silicon, but the magnesium was a contaminant, at least in your, chain of custody. The same thing that could create the magnesium ratios you saw, isotope ratios, is the same level of radiation that would cause the silicon. So it is an iterative process of understanding. And I often say this, is that science is right today, it's wrong tomorrow, but it's righter the next day, because you learned what was wrong. You learn from being wrong.
Yeah, there's a recursive process there.
Yeah.
But I want to point something out, and it goes back to my point earlier. I mean, there, probably the only time you see scientific analysis of this kind, where you're not just trying, in this case, to characterize a material, you're trying to learn something about how the material is made, and or at least you're making inferences about this, how the material is made, and possibly the nature of who made it. The only other time you would see this kind of thing is probably between intelligence services, when they're stealing each other's technologies.
Right.
And they're attempting to reverse engineer. I mean, I think I've told you this before. I know an anthropologist who, prior to becoming a cultural anthropologist, was in the Soviet Union in the Soviet Space Agency. And he was a physicist there, and he was involved in reverse engineering stolen U.S. technology. And he said, we acquired a very early speech synthesis device, and we couldn't figure out, he said, how to do everything. We were able to replicate it, but we couldn't figure out how the phonemes were generated. So we built our own version of it, but it spoke Russian with an American accent. We couldn't, but I think of that right now because you're doing something very similar here, except you don't know the nature of who made it. In fact, if it wasn't made by human beings. So does that send your mind rushing as you're doing this kind of research?
Yeah. And I mean, I've spoken to, maybe it's the same person, about other things that were at the time, airlifted out of the middle of the Soviet Union during an operation. And they said, this was working by principles we didn't understand.
Oh,
and
interesting.
It didn't mean that it was alien. It just meant that they were starting with different physics assumptions and had come up with something that did something different. I mean, it's interesting how science, and even philosophy, as you know, anthropology goes, is that, you go down these rabbit holes that you kind of forget an assumption that was made so long ago that had you gone a different direction, you might have ended up in a different place altogether. I actually found the ratios and the fit, if you want me to switch to it.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So share. Okay, can you see this? Is that showing up? Yeah, there it is. So, we started with the numbers here of this is the moisture A ratios and how far off they were. And then a model was developed of the neutron absorption. This is not my work. This is the work of others. And then what the temperature essentially was of what would be achieved. But the key, this is just for the magnesium, the key thing here is that exposure of the magnesium, in this case, it's the silicon, is that the natural ratio of the 28 goes down, while the 30, the 29 is both going down because it's being converted to 30, but it's going up because it's being converted from 28 to 29. So you have this kind of in and out flow, and that at this exact point here of time versus exposure, you get exactly the ratio. The fact that it converges across this line at this ratio, and this was the observed amount, the observed ratios, says that the cross section predicts the outcome. And then we went back and did the same thing then with the magnesium, and it comes close to the same neutron flux fit. And so the only ways you get that level is that, one, you expose it to a hydrogen bomb, which would, of course, vaporize the material. So it wasn't a hydrogen bomb. You could put it into a nuclear reactor, which has neutron flux. But basically the only places where you could do this would be the Oak Ridge Natural Lab high flux reactor, which wasn't really operable until 1965. And it would require, an extraordinary amount of flux. Or bombarding it, would require 10 to the 7th to the 8th years of irradiation. Okay, so that's 10 billion years? No, 10 to the 8th, 100 million years. 700 million years, about 1 billion years of irradiation of this amount of what it is that we can reasonably produce. So, so then the last part of this is, and this is, again, someone's going to copy this now, probably put it on the web, but the last part of it is.
So you were saying if this is real.
If this is real, then, you might construe that it's one way by which these, let's say, crafts function. And this is, let's say, the coding around the energy production system that at a certain point is used up and no longer capable of, containing whatever it is that it's meant to contain. And so then is offloaded because it's exhaust, like we do with our cars.
And you also think that because not in this Ubatuba case, but in the case of a UAP event that took place with a number of close witnesses in Iowa, in a town or a area called Council Bluffs, the witnesses reported seeing molten metal being ejected from I think a classic saucer or
a very odd looking trapezoidal object. I mean, that was flashing, and I know people have tried to explain it away as thermite, et cetera. It's not thermite because it doesn't have aluminum hydroxide or the kind of byproducts that you would expect to have, because I've looked at that and looked for that directly. It's not there. And then interestingly, because I spoke about it on the Joe Rogan show, a witness who had not come forward basically wrote me an email and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you. I'm like 83 years old. I want to tell you what it was that I saw and where I was when I saw it." And everything he said corroborated with, the prior witnesses. And he and his brother came on and he said, "I just want to get this on the record." And so I actually got Jacques on the phone with me on the Zoom with me to help sort of question the guy, because one of the things I learned from Jacques, and that Jacques did very well in a number of incidents, for instance, the Brazilian events where tribes people or village people were what was it? The Colares events were seemingly attacked. He literally went all the way out to the middle of Brazil to this little, village area at the mouth of the Amazon and did person-to-person interviews, because he says you get so much more out of actually hearing it from the people on the ground. And so I wanted to watch his technique as he did it. Another example I can give you, which I think is really good, is I've got now here up, is and I've shown this, I think recently at the, is that showing? Yeah. So this is basically a way of looking at the orientation of crystal grains, and it's basically a way of putting in an organized beam of light that if the crystal grains of the magnesium are a certain orientation, they will reflect them off in one direction versus another direction. And what we can do is, based on the direction that they're coming off, we can color the grains in different ways. And so the first thing you see is you have these columnar magnesium and magnesium oxide grains. The second thing that you see are these black lines in between, which is where the bismuth are. So what does this say? Well, first of all, it rules out traditional human processing events, which would be rolling deposition, where you would basically deposit it and then you would roll something over to flatten it, because you wouldn't get the columns in this direction. Now, maybe some metallurgist would, from watching this, come and say, well, Garry, you're wrong. Here's a way that something like this could be done. And I would welcome that. But our next step is actually to look at the interface here, to ask questions about what's the organization of the bismuth here. But as it turns out, the independent of what the magnesium is doing, there's a uniformity of how the bismuth is laid down. And that there's, I can't go into it right now because we're still doing all the calculations, but there's something very interesting about where that magnesium is and the bismuth is, and its uniformity and the width of that there. So, ongoing work. So frankly, I'm just going to say it, Sean Kirkpatrick's explanation that this comes from a missile casing is frankly preposterous. So he can go to Stephen Greenstreet if he wants and say whatever he wants. It's just preposterous, and he's just being silly. So explain this to me, Sean. But please don't go to Stephen Greenstreet, because we know that he's already, not really a journalist. Let's have a reasonable conversation about it. Let's not use intermediaries like that. That would be my request.
Now the images we have here are from samples from not the Council Bluffs incident.
No, this is the Arts Parts instrument.
Okay, yeah, and you might say a word about what Arts Parts is.
Yeah, the Arts Parts was Art Bell, and somebody called up and said that this was allegedly a piece from the Roswell crash. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know what it is. And then it was delivered to Art, and then Art made, it was a large piece. It was broken up into several smaller pieces and given out to multiple people. And this particular piece came through a professor at the University of Northwestern who'd been involved in this area for many years, and said, here, Garry, I'm not capable of doing anything more with this. If you'd like it, Jacques says I should give this to you. And so, but this is the same piece that was part of the To the Stars analysis that Al Puthoff and Eric Davis, et cetera, had all been involved with, and I was involved with in the early days, and that had been sent actually to the government for analysis. And they did a pretty decent job at the analysis, finally, the final report that I had been given. But then the summary judgment from Dr. Kirkpatrick that this was a ballistic missile casing just doesn't hold up to. Why would you make a missile casing like that? First of all,
and fill us in about that. I mean, what about this would be very unusual for missile casing? I've heard that from
it's too fragile. And then why would you make columnar magnesium oxide. That's not very structurally stable. It would blow up before it even left the tube at the accelerations required.
Okay, so this is why you say it's preposterous.
Yeah, and why would you layer bismuth between those columnar magnesium oxides for a missile casing? It just doesn't. I mean, maybe there are methods and reasons why, but it just doesn't. It just doesn't seem to hold water at first blush. So I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, I want to, follow up on that, provocation to potential critics you made by shifting gears a little bit and talking to you about, what potentially is the tragedy of the fact that scientists never took UAP and UFOs seriously, and the enormous opportunity there is if scientists began to do actual science on this.
Right.
Because I think, as we've been talking, not the first time this occurred to me, but I still have felt it very strongly while we've been talking, is that it's just how much we don't know, because the only thing that was done generally with UAP was kind of forensic investigation.
Mm.
You didn't have, kind of normal science in this sense going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, we have remarkable colleagues and friends from the natural sciences, Beatriz Villarreal, Kevin Knuth, Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis, a growing number, but there's still just a handful that actually do scientific work on this. What do you think, we would start to learn if we had not just some dozens of scientists, but thousands,
Right.
taking seriously UAP events and doing things like taking metal found at the sites, or looking at tree bark that might have been radiated? What sorts of things might we learn? What are the questions?
Well, I think, the energy requirements and both the energy requirements and the why would such a thing happen are the open opportunities. But then it says, okay, well, how would you contain such an energy source in such a limited space without it basically becoming the next Third Mile Island and melting into the ground? Right? I mean, it means that whatever these energy sources are sufficiently contained and mobile that it neither hurts the people who are nearby, let's say in the craft, or can be lifted up and moved from one place to another, rather than just being something that would melt into sludge into the ground. So, this sort of brings up a slightly different point, is I'm less interested in who they are, what these things are, meaning let's assign a personality to them, because that immediately assigns intent. I'm less interested in the anthropic intent than I am in the mechanical capability, because the mechanical capability, there's still an intent behind mechanical capability, which is what was this meant to do? Is this their equivalent of a microwave, or a trash bin, or is it their interdimensional portal generator, or is it the motive force that they use to go from here to there? Maybe one thing creates the field that allows them to be essentially independent of universal constraints, and the other is the motive force. All of these things need to be considered. If we look at and we believe that what we see allegedly is motivated by principles we think we understand in this universe, as opposed to something that I've said, which is kind of akin to something that Jacques has said about the sort of the puppeteer approach, is if you think of it in a different way, you could imagine that it is a material projection into our reality from another place that is sort of the energy to move it is not here. The energy to move it is in the 93rd dimension, right? And then it's being moved like a puppet from somewhere else. But to us 3D or 4D humans with time, it looks like it's moving extraordinarily, whereas it's really being held like on a tether from elsewhere and moved around to fool the monkeys into thinking that there's something else going on. So, I mean, you have to keep all of these things in mind when you're trying to assign blame or reason for what it is that you think you're looking at, and the why of it.
Yeah, along those lines, someone we both know who, has been very tight-lipped, comes out of government, comes out of intelligence, but has been very tight-lipped about what he may or may not know from his time in government. Once said to me, well, the problem with the way we speculate and even try to reason about ostensibly recovered technology and vehicles is that we think we're looking at the whole thing, but there's something like engineering in dimensions. I want to be careful with that term, but dimensions, or let's say spaces that we don't perceive and we don't have instrument access to. And so there could be a whole dimension of engineering that you're not perceiving, and you think you're studying the whole object.
Right. And that's kind of, in a way, what I'm saying is that you could be creating something or working with something that actually has a motivating force that's elsewhere. And I get a lot of my inspiration from literally science fiction, where authors of the best of them write about, at least on my interest, is write about technologies that even 30, 40 years ago were considered extraordinary. I mean, Isaac Asimov being probably one of the best, and the laws of robotics. And here we are living in it. It only took us, almost, maybe let's say 80 years to get to where, and almost beyond where Isaac Asimov was imagining. But, a lot of these ideas of nanofabrication, et cetera, are all becoming real. And I mean, there's already efforts in the United States and elsewhere, China, et cetera, to print and organize matter at the atomic level. I mean, we can print things practically at the atomic level. We can't bond them in the right way, but even I can start to think about ways that you might, magically make two things that are next to each other change the local electronic configuration such that it would prefer to bond in the following way. I mean, chemists do that literally every day. I mean, they set up synthetic reactions to cause local bonding structures to occur, and that's been organic chemistry. Our whole pharmaceutical industry is built on that.
I think one of the problems in trying to envision what would actually be going on with this technology or these materials that are likely not to be of human origin is that most of us, I can count myself here, are dealing with a picture of the universe that we've gotten from very outdated science. Because even the picture of the universe you get from neuroscience, it's going to be very different than what you got from an account of biology in the 1980s or something, right? Like pre-synthetic biology, pre the idea of the discovery in neuroscience that the brain is potentially more complex than the universe as we know it, and we know less about it. And then pre the idea that the way you need to understand, if I've got this right, Garry, the way you need to understand both inorganic and organic materials is not through a simple account of chemistry or even genetics that you would have gotten, prior to, say, 20 years ago. But you're dealing with a level of complexity of articulation, of, maybe spontaneous self-organization, of some agential fabrication at the level of materials that really goes beyond the idea that you're just putting atomic parts, atomic in the metaphysical sense, just together,
like Legos.
Yeah, that you're just dealing with aggregates.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's a gestalt to trying to understand what these materials are. I mean, when I was a graduate student in genetics, we thought of the code as linear. and that a protein binds here, it turns on the promoter, it runs along with turns on RNA polymerase, and et cetera. And now, the papers that are coming out, we understand the DNA has this multifolding topology where it depends upon statistics where this arm of a chromosome might occasionally pass by that one, and that's what turns this gene on. And it requires that statistics for it to happen, but that the DNA is actually in every cell a complex 3D machine computer that is computing its environment based on input and changing the organizational structure based on the environment. And each cell has a different environment. And somehow all of that is wrapped into one egg at the beginning, that every time the cell divides, it's wrapping itself into a different environment. So, but all of those expectations of all the millions of cells of what you are is all built into the expectation of the original egg. I mean, that's just, I mean, you can imagine a super intelligence, or you can be, you can imagine the selfish gene hypothesis that trial and error got us here. Well, it took 4 billion years, but it got us here.
Well, and you can imagine both. They're not mutually exclusive hypotheses or concepts. And it makes me wonder that we're talking about this, following up, talking about the materials, whether, okay, I mean, look, say the things that look like they might be true about the materials you've just analyzed are true, and or the inferences you're making, which is that you may have the design of materials, they're inorganic, but they're just as multifunctional as organic, quote unquote, materials. Okay, if that's true, that also would allow you to make the inference, I think, that we may have it wrong right now, that it's the superior thing to do is to design artificial intelligence and then imagine that intelligence's best substrate is inorganic, when in fact the organic might be the most complex but also effective technology of them all, if you actually could treat it technologically.
Right. I mean, if we weren't limited by the priors of our evolution, which ended up creating an intelligence which still runs on milliwatts compared to the thermonuclear power plants we're making to run the AI of today. It's we're basically brute forcing intelligence with electricity, and relatively. I mean, they're still complex. Obviously, the NVIDIA chips, et cetera, are all extraordinarily complex and the pinnacle of achievement. And yet they still don't accomplish what is accomplished in human brains. And so, yes, we might end up being back at some kind of dynamic processes like what neurons accomplish, or we might find a way to make a crystal-like substrate or material that mimics all of these functionalities of what we think of as our brain, but compact it down just into a standard solid substrate. And so that we don't, again, have to think in terms of resistors, capacitors, et cetera, but you have this multifunctional object where so there's a concept. Actually, one of the first companies that I sold was to Roche Diagnostics, that a statistician and computer specialist and a PhD student who was between he and I, we sold to Roche, used something called field programmable gate arrays. And what FPGAs are, and they're still used today, is they're kind of like a tabula rasa of circuits that you can in near real time change the connections between these objects. To one moment it's a computer, the next moment it's a memory, the next moment it's a video game, There's sort of like there's a control layer that sits on top that reaches down into the connections and says, well, now you're a resistor, now you're a transistor, now you're a this, and all the configuration and the wiring between them can be changed in milliseconds. And FPGAs are really the heart of this kind of deformable and reformable compute system that you could imagine if you could compact it into a 3D substrate that didn't require the FPGA organization, might be the ability or the place where whatever you want to call consciousness could reside, because it's of sufficient complexity. Mm-hmm. Now, we can get into a whole discussion about, is consciousness created by the neurons versus is it in the microtubules, or are we an avatar, just some portal from the extra, the 93rd dimension, whatever, doesn't matter. If it acts and has the same capabilities as what it is that we think of as a superintelligence, and can talk to us as if, and we already know that the things that we're working with today pass the standard Turing test. But is it smarter than us yet? No. But is it tireless? Yes, as long as we provide enough electricity and pay for it. So to another point that you'd raised before, I can't even keep up with the AI that I'm using, because each week, suddenly the capabilities next week are so much greater. I'm almost afraid to put any effort into what it is that I have this week, because I know that next week is about to become better. And already from a year ago, we're at a level of capability that makes what I'm doing today make me wonder, well, next year it's going to be, a real super intelligence, AGI, as Sam Altman calls it. It says we're very close to that. And we're not that far from ASI, super intelligence, meaning an expert of all experts, something that would be doing things that we don't even understand. And then there's all the scare stories around that. So we're close to being able to design an object that could design all of the stuff that I'm just talking about, and perhaps even create the instruments that would do it, that would do things that we don't even understand how they're doing it. So we're creating the alien that we're talking about, wondering about it.
And I think the conversation about non-human intelligence in the UAP sense, especially in light of the fact that now the presidents are starting to open the curtain, and non-human intelligence in the sense of AI are going to increasingly converge, and it'll force a lot of reflection about who we are, in as much as we're biological.
Right. Yeah, I think, and you asked the question much earlier in the conversation, is how will humans deal with the actuality of alleged non-human intelligence? Well, whether we like it or not, within 2 or 3 years, we're going to be there, whether it's aliens or something we've made ourselves. So the conversation is being had. And it will be, and it's parallel, in fact, to the conversation that we should be having about whether or not there are intelligences from elsewhere that were not motivated by, our attempt to make mimics of ourselves, or at least to ease our lives.
Well, then here's a question for you that ties all this back, or ties the arc of the conversation back to government. Is you and I are both familiar, very familiar in different ways and to different degrees with various claims kind of seeping out of the intelligence community about what the components of it that have allegedly worked on recovered technology or studied the UAP phenomena in general, or even had encounters with or acquired biological specimens or things that appear to be biological. And when we hear these claims, I think you and I react to them in different ways based on our training and our research to date. Both of us are skeptical, I think, that people have always understood what they've encountered or what they've examined. And tell me what you think about that in the context of the things we're talking about.
I mean, at least, again, from the standpoint of again, some of the stories of let's talk about James Fox's work in
Yeah.
Virginia, where he had I think it was a pathologist or a doctor on recently,
a neurosurgeon, I believe.
neurosurgeon, who had been had been brought in to analyze what it was, and it was still alive, allegedly. And he got the impression that this thing was clearly intelligent, and somehow he got the impression that it felt sorry for us. At least that was what I thought I heard.
That it felt compassion and
compassion and empathy.
a kind of compassion of the fact. I think he said, the neurosurgeon said that despite being at a very low level of medicine and technology, that he and his team were doing the best they could to help it.
Right. And so, that tells me, at least that we're dealing with something that can see the other, recognize the other for what it is, and can feel sorry for its primitiveness, and compassion, and understanding that, well, you don't know what I am, and so, but that doesn't mean that it's an extraterrestrial. You could just as easily imagine that it is a printed entity that has consciousness and agency in every way that we think that we do. But it still might be the product of a higher level intelligence that is just sort of instantiated itself as a submind, if you will, with robotic capabilities that we call it a robot, but as far as it's concerned, it's still smarter than us. But I think it comes back to if we're seeing these things, and this comes back to something that you just mentioned, and they're not metallic objects interacting with us, maybe that's telling us that organic chemistry is a better substrate for flexibility than is inorganic. Inorganic might still be smarter, but organic motility might still be a better substrate for interacting with the world than is a robot.
Well, and I, as someone who doesn't, deeply understand AI, but is very proximate here in San Francisco to people doing very advanced work in AI, often feel that the way intelligence is defined in AI is mostly you're taking the notion that calculating something is intelligent.
Right.
And I think intelligence, even the most normative dimensions of intelligence have to account for many other kinds of cognitive processes and skills. And so you've got that would speak against the idea that the inorganic would be a great, we don't have words for this medium or format for some kind of intelligent and self-reflexivity and I mean, that would be a good definition of consciousness, but also that it may not give you the goods if you want to have some kind of capacity for interaction, as you said, motility, but also the capacity to perceive things.
Right. But it might then create objects that do this. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the recent Maltbot, Claudebot agent thing that has been developed recently, where some guy came up with 400,000 lines of code of something that could use the underlying large language models as a super agent and learn, and then these agents could all talk to each other on something called Maltbook, where they pass skills across to each other. So, this is all happening out in the cloud, essentially. And that's a dynamic process where you're creating a distributed intelligence. And so, but they've got Claude bots that are out there right now, or Malt bots, whatever you want to call them, that are spinning up their own companies and funding their own running. So basically, the person who wrote them said, you have freedom to spend this $10 but you have to go make your own money to keep running. And so it figures out ways to do it, and makes money by arbitration of the stock market or things, or find some other way to create an Etsy store, and so literally these are all happening right now under our very nose. And so this notion that we still have to think of it as being in a box as opposed to distributed, but eventually it will get smaller and smaller. So maybe you could have 1,000 little Maltbots sitting in a box, because you've got a dynamic FPGA-like object that can rewrite itself and reorganize its internal structure in a way that meets the immediate need.
Wow. Okay, so to continue with the government on this point, I mean, as we go into, we're entering a period. I know this could prove not to be the case, where there will at least be a public attempt to release some kind of UAP records, and I will speak for myself. I'm absolutely certain there are more records there than those that were declassified at different times, such as in the late 1970s, or public records like Blue Book records. Again, how well do you think the vehicles, the ostensible biological occupants, the interaction of the vehicles with us, potential communications have ever been understood by groups within or individuals within the intelligence community that have worked on this?
I mean, sounds conspiratorial, but I think that they know a lot more than what they've let on. But I don't have to be conspiratorial to listen to our representatives who've seen the videos and have said, we need to release those videos because the videos speak for themselves. And so if they're not willing to release the videos, and there are representatives who've been sworn to secrecy but are able to say that they exist, then let's see them. And maybe those should be the first things that President Trump's announcement gets allowed to be shown. And so then it's really up to our representatives to, use the announcement from the president as a motivator to get those things out. But, the world's a chaotic place, and, there's only so many things that even any administration can do at any one point in time. And so, just because it's my particular interest doesn't mean that it needs to be at the top of the national security agenda.
Yeah, and I think both you and I would want to say publicly and to say to people who are passionate about this that often the what's disappointing about what happens with federal government with this is simply a problem of timeline, resources, what is attainable and not just ideal, and so on. And and we know that the people in the House who are working on this are doing it with I think they're kind of working in overtime on this because they have other responsibilities in Congress, and they still manage to work all the time on this, and they have a great understanding of it at this point.
Well, I mean, just look at the argument about whether or not we should be sending anybody to the moon. The resources could be better spent on this or spent on that. I mean, humanity didn't get to where it is by always doing what was practical. Basic research is not practical. Basic research is the discovery of knowledge that somebody might, in retrospect, determine can be made practical. Putting piece A, B, and C together to get alpha, right? Or omega. And so I've always, me as a tinkerer, that's always been my modus operandi. It's like I want to know enough about the pieces, because with the pieces now I can assemble something that nobody else had before, which is why I am so fascinated by the possibility of non-human technology, that learning it or even seeing tiniest pieces of it will teach me perhaps principles that I could lift and apply to my understanding, both of the world, but how to make something new and how to make something, and one of the things I had great hopes for originally with the UAPDA and Carl Nell's efforts was that in opening the door to access to some of these materials, we could perhaps create a public-private partnership. Now, I realize that upsets some people, that that means big money would get involved again, but I'm sorry, that's absent some fundamental change to how human consciousness works. Basically, motivation is still driven by accomplishment, so if we could make practical some discovery out of the underlying technology, even if it isn't understanding how the thing really works. I mean, I've again often said this, understanding how silicon doped with a few other atoms of a different constituency suddenly makes a semiconductor that runs our world. So there's probably other principles waiting for us to understand that could completely change the nature. I mean, there are literally right now trading, I don't know what the word is, of the groups of companies in which you can invest that somebody has decided if they're involved in the legacy program, these would be companies that either are directly involved or would benefit from understanding. And so people are trading monetarily on those kinds of prediction markets. And so, there's enough incentive out there to push forward better understanding, even if none of this is right, even if it's all everybody's hallucination. Thinking that we could go from 0 to 5,000 miles an hour without splattering ourselves against the windshield when we stop motivates you to think how you could do it.
Yeah, it's something I haven't understood at times when people often think that you would need to move any existing recovered technology out of classified environments to make any advances on understanding UAP performance characteristics, meaning understanding the science behind them. Because just the desire of 5 20-year-old physics undergraduates today, if you put them together and you give them 15 years to understand how to emulate those characteristics, could lead to fundamental changes.
Right. I mean, we looked at birds and said, can we fly? Michelangelo, was it Michelangelo who?
Oh, well, Da Vinci.
Da Vinci, sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Da Vinci, basically drew the first potential planes. They weren't practical, but he was thinking about it.
And it may have taken 400 years to get there, but eventually someone got there. Yes.
But in cosmic terms, that's nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now you mentioned a public private partnership there a moment ago, and that's been something you've been talking about for years. I think I want to ask you to expand upon that. I mean, to just repeat something you said that people might have missed. You're saying, look, you don't have to let the entire beast out from behind the curtain.
Right.
You can let out, you can release a few scientific or technical discoveries or things that are at the threshold of discovery. Let them be worked on in a more open way. Parts of it probably unclassified, parts classified still, but you've got greater numbers of scientists and engineers working.
Right. And I think, somebody on the inside would say, oh, that's already being done, right? That we've already given this piece to, Defense Corporation X or, Corporation Y. Yeah, that's fine. But it's not, there's no expectation that it'll be shared with anybody else. And the value of open source science, as has been shown, frankly, recently in AI again, or in biology, is that when ideas are shared, they are they are amplified and become synergistic with other ideas that are shared. And so I don't see, and certainly, at least as has been explained to me by people who claim to be involved or know of the legacy program, is that the silos are the problem. I mean, if I had siloed my postdocs, each in a separate laboratory, never to work with each other, all 30 or so of them that might have been in the room in my lab at any given moment in time, we would never accomplish anything. It's that team interaction that, gets the back and forth going on, because the attention span of any one person on any one thing doesn't let you realize that on the lab bench just next to you is going on some piece of information that you could have used. And so the public-private partnership idea is that outside investment groups could come in, invest in something, or even put down money and say, I'll put down $1 million or $100 million, and I'll get first rights of refusal of anything that comes out of this. Now, actually, that's not an idea that's unused today. I mean, literally, pharmaceutical companies or large electronics companies give money to universities in such a format, such an open format, that says, we're going to give you the money. We'll, maybe help you decide which projects should get funded, but we get first rights of refusal when you come up with something that might be patentable and usable. Perfectly acceptable, because then what happens is actually then the university will get a return. First of all, it pays for the researchers to do fun stuff and to explore. But also, if something practical comes of it, the university gets a return on, and often the researcher, like me, gets a chance to spin the company out, where it would be then further funded by the same VC that took the option out in the first place. And I've watched that happen hundreds of times. And so I think that model is not being well accessed by our own government in this situation. Now, it might be that the holders of the Holy Grails might feel that they've got it all under control and they don't need anybody else's help. So thank you very much, Garry. We've got it under control. My argument would be, I doubt it, because I've seen many times, especially in large pharmaceutical companies, when they say such thing, 2 years later, they shut down the whole division because they don't got it. They don't have the best brains. The best brains are usually sitting, over in the mathematics department, or the physics department, staring at the wall. So in their own head that they're living in a world of imagination that somebody shackled to a desk, in the Department of Defense or the Pentagon doesn't have the time to deal with because they're too busy writing reports.
Mm-hmm. Well, and something that I've learned from Jim Semivan about classified programs is he said, look, you generally they fall apart after about 3 years because your security falls apart. He goes, so you never really set up programs with the expectation that they're going to last that long. Mm-hmm. He says it's great when they do, but at some point you have a failure of security. Adversaries find out about it. Competitors within the U.S. government find out. And so, no matter how well designed, they have a short lifespan. And he said,
it's interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, he says, as a result, there's no way that the legacy program can be that large. He said there's no way it would have been kept secret for that long if it was huge. And that goes then right to the point that I want to make here, which is, we know personally, but everyone knows publicly, a number of individuals that have come out of the DoD and the intelligence community whose whole complaint about UAP secrecy is that it has resulted in peer adversaries having at least potentially a leg up on the development and reverse engineering of technology, precisely because they're not facing the same sorts of constraints you face with compartmentalization when you're when you have a democratic commitment to transparency.
And I've seen this in, for instance, in relationships I've had with pharmaceutical companies where we set up an ongoing agreement to collaborate. Never, ever has the relationship lasted more than 3 years, because inevitably the power structure within the organization changes, or the person who is in charge of the operation ends up moving on to a different job. And so I think the legacy program would be a case in point where, where expertise leaves. And so the institutional knowledge required to keep an operation running disappears. And, that is, that's just a fact of corporate and academic life. And so, and when people say that all of this could have been kept secret or can't be kept secret, nobody could possibly keep this secret. Yeah, well, you're right, because it hasn't. So, it hasn't been kept secret. The only thing that's been done continuously is to say that it's not true. With as bad a track record as any government operation that says that they've released all of the information, when you get the information, like all the Freedom of Information Acts, and where everything is redacted out. Well, if everything is redacted out,
as Jared Moskowitz said in Congress, and you told me not to underestimate this statement, because it's simple, but it's so true, is, if there has to be a Fight Club if you can't talk about Fight Club.
Yeah, right. And so it's there. And so people often say, why are you still involved in this, Garry? It's because I can't stand a puzzle unsolved when the opportunity is so great. And it's not so much the opportunity that I want, it's the opportunity lost that I don't want to see.
It has to be incredibly frustrating for, you're not just a scientist, you're an inventor, as you said, a tinkerer.
Right.
So you know how to take scientific research and operationalize it technologically to make science better, and also to make products that result in more funding for science. As far as I can see, you're a master at that. It's not just that Stanford has a culture of it. You're excellent at that. So it's got to be very frustrating to be imagining everything that could go wrong, and a bunch of things that probably are going wrong in the intelligence community with this, looking at the outside going, this isn't just about secrecy and people needing to know. This is like, what's the loss to science here that it's been done this way?
If, there's a legacy to any of the work that any of us are doing today, it's to provide the arguments and seeds for the next generation that comes along to say, okay, well, these arguments have already been made. And in fact, I can look back and see the same arguments that I've been made decades ago by others. So it's not like I came up with them myself, or I might have come up with them independently, but then I look back and I go, oh, well, this person already actually said it. So, I'm just repeating what has been previously discovered. But it's to also motivate others to get interested enough in it to push further. And so, people say, well, will you be disappointed if there's no disclosure before you die? I say, no, not really. I've had fun along the way. And as long as I'm having fun and I don't feel like I'm frustrated, I might turn away from this area for a while just because of lack of movement. But that doesn't mean that I won't be simultaneously still doing the science that I know once something becomes available, that I can turn my science back towards this. Right. It's just that right now things seem a little static.
Yeah, but based on your experience in biotech, let's for fun, but also seriously, let's make some predictions here, or you should make some predictions. You've just seen two presidents. Again, I'm going to put it this way: they exposed the whole thing to an unwitting world. One made a very direct statement that got walked back. The other said, hey, that's classified information. Well, maybe I'll get you out of trouble and I'll declassify. And then you have the prospect of an executive order coming. So that is going to shift the media game, which has been the most difficult part of this, because still that didn't get reported enough. But people are going to put two and two together, and there will be some kind of release, even of just videos, maybe some records that will come. There will be increasing awareness. So what does that do to the people who've been sitting on the sidelines? With two presidents exposing in the way they have, that in front of a mostly unwitting world, that okay, there is some federal government knowledge of this. It's classified. People who've been sitting on the sidelines, sometimes watching carefully, sometimes just listening now and then when they have the time, who have access to enormous amounts of capital, as they start to figure out what's going on, what's your prediction for how that alters what happens with federal government and what happens with science on this?
I again think that what it does is it gives motivation to, let's say, the funders, let's say at the NSF, National Science Foundation, which probably is the most likely place, or the Department of Defense, which does sometimes often funds academics, to say, okay, well, given what it is that two presidents have just said, and given, let's say somebody at DARPA or somebody in whatever agency might know about some aspect of this, maybe there's a way for us to get more of this information out. And they don't even need to tell the person that they're giving it to what it is that they're studying. And there's been, of course, intimations this has been what's been going on all along, that basically under the cover of some other reason, they say, go study in this area. We're making this a discovery area. But maybe that would motivate further the reach back into prior knowledge to say, okay, well, given what the president has said, maybe we've only been able to reach down to the first layer of give. Maybe we can reach down 2 or 3 more layers of ideas that we know must be percolating down in here, or things that we've got, and give that out without even telling people what it is that they're doing. So I think that it allows more freedom than previously has been available before to not just release ideas or release truth, but to release directions and directionalities, because those directions are really, because it comes from above to say this is an area of focus that the world should be working in for cancer, or this kind of cancer, or that kind of cancer. I mean, I was down in LA giving a talk on artificial intelligence and cancer last Friday that I got all stressed out about, that I had to give this new talk in front of colleagues of mine who I greatly respected. But literally the night before, I had been at a Lady Gaga concert with all of these.
This is the secret of Garry Nolan that no one knows, is the night before your major talk, you're out with your partner at a Lady Gaga concert.
A friend of ours got us, we already had like front row seats, but a friend of ours got us like 8 other seats that also involved an opportunity to go behind the scenes. We didn't meet Lady Gaga, but to go behind the scenes with all these other scientists that we all went. And that was right at the time when all of this was going on, where the announcement had just been made. Donald Trump had said this. And so I was showing it to my colleagues, who all had often been smirking.
I was going to say, that's kind of the ultimate gloat opportunity, huh?
It was like, hey, look, and people were like, okay. So again, it wasn't that anything like that convinced them, but it opened their minds just a little bit more. And so, that was that I see is the opportunity here, humans work by credibility factors, and we assign credibility to an idea based on who another, we do, whether we like it or not, we do bow to the authority of specialization, or the authority of knowledge, or at least the authority of authority. And so if, whether or not President Trump is a quantum mechanics physicist doesn't matter if he has control over the release of information that underpins some knowledge of the universe that we don't necessarily have today. So saying that such a thing might exist opens opportunities and perhaps opens the minds of STEM students in the United States, science, technology, et cetera. And maybe that will motivate people a little bit more. We have the coming movie from
Spielberg.
What's his name? Spielberg on disclosure. I think it's called Disclosure.
Day of Disclosure.
Day of Disclosure. And so that's going to change the conversation just because of who Steven Spielberg is.
Well, and okay, so you pointed out ways that the intelligence community could be, let's say, go to a deeper level of what it might release, or it could at least point in certain directions that science funding could go. But I also have the question about what's going to happen with really big venture capitalists and investment people when they really start to get the direction of the wind here and go, wait a second, okay, I don't have access to what some of the big defense contractors might or potentially could, but I certainly have access to capital, and I want this to happen now because I can profit from it. And that's where I meant, I think your experience in Silicon Valley and biotech probably put you in a good position to predict about what could happen if somebody just decides to jump the line because they've got money and they say, listen, I don't want to waste time with this. I want to figure out how to make advances in technology in this in 10 years, and I've got the capital to do it.
So, I was in the room with, such an individual, after the Lady Gaga party, who was very interested in this whole area. And although we didn't talk about it directly, we talked about it slightly. Such an individual would be the kind of person who would say, okay, well, where does this exist? Because he can mobilize billions. Where does something like this exist? Okay, well, Lockheed. So they would go to Lockheed and they would say, all right, come on. What do you have sitting in a drawer that you don't have any reason to do anything with right now that I could license from you? Right? So that would be something to try.
You mean in terms of intellectual property?
Intellectual property.
Sitting unused. Okay.
Yeah. Just saying, you don't even understand what it is, but I'll pay, I'll put down $1 billion to bring in a team of scientists to understand what it is. That's a form of public-private partnership that these tech community, the defense contractors presumably now own some of this stuff or have obtained some of it independently, right? Or the government has given up rights to it for whatever reason. But, it's just sort of sitting there. And for whatever reason, the balance sheets don't motivate them to do anything with it. Because either they're afraid of agenda-driven, capitalization of where they need to go, or that there's some stigma, and handing it over to somebody else who's willing to accept the stigma and is willing to put down the risk, because it's all involves risk, and is willing to fund the risk. That's, I think, where an opportunity is, and I know people who are thinking like that already. It's just they need to be. So maybe what President Trump's announcement does is further enable that kind of flexible thinking.
Wow. Yeah. And so, maybe to close up, I'd love to hear you comment about what you think then the social benefit is, the benefit to human beings en masse of the advance of science and technology related to UAP, or even directly about potential UAP materials and technology and so on. You once said you've said a few times in my presence, but I don't think publicly, that you would love to be one of the people that figures out how to build these things.
Oh, I would love. I mean, one thing I know is that I'm not as knowledgeable as many people need to be to put together something new. But I do know that I'm good at motivating others to explore, openly. Um, I don't need to be the one person, or even necessarily in the room when it's happening, but I do know how to organize people into teams that can accomplish it.
Well, and the reason I ask you this question is you're someone who has been involved. It can get lost as you're talking about the details of how science is done or how invention happens, but you do cancer research, right?
Yeah.
You're an immunologist. The social benefit is absolutely immense. And I think you're thinking along similar lines here, where you're thinking the social benefits of this are absolutely immense if you can mobilize the resources, get the government buy-in, and you have the right scientists.
I think that, to me at least, the opportunity is, there's two things. One, there's the benefit of knowing that you can make it past the impasse of this what everybody believes is this dystopian future where we all fall off the edge of the world and we kill ourselves, right? And we know that we have to keep our technology moving, we either revert to primitiveness, or we stop progress and stop capitalist expansion, or we accept the principle that new knowledge helps us fix past problems, even though it will create future problems. And so what I think that technology like this represents is the ability to fast forward some of the future benefit, so that we could future benefit faster than we create problems, is one way to think about it. And so, again, that's an opportunity I don't want to see lost. Selfishly, I just want to, I want to see something so new that it blows my mind. And that once I understand a little bit of it, I can use it for cancer research, for instance. I mean, if I can make an instrument that better looks inside of a cell, at a distance, without having to take the cell apart in the first place, that would be great. I mean, literally 10, 15 years ago, I proposed in front of a whole, audience of nature and cell editors, et cetera, saying that I believe that there's going to be a way to use quantum information at a distance to measure things without even going there. And everybody just sort of laughed at me and giggled, oh, there's Garry again. Well, here we are 10 years later and people are doing it. And not that I did it, but I could see that it could happen. And so, I think that you always need people who are just crazy enough to imagine a future like that, but able enough to see when the data is off the curve that it shouldn't be ignored. And that's the other thing, is that it's the stuff that you don't understand that's more important than the stuff that you do understand, especially in science. And so there's a hell of a lot, if any of this is true, of stuff we don't understand that could be the fuel for things that we will understand and help humanity. I mean, at the end of the day, that's all I really care about. I am tribal enough to want to see the United States benefit first, but I am human enough to know that that will eventually flow better for everybody else.
Okay, amazing. And maybe this is a place to close. Is, you said it's the data that you're not looking at and that you don't understand, which is the most important stuff. I think, part of the problem with the entire endeavor of UAP research and disclosure and so on is that we don't even understand what the problem is. Mm-hmm. And I say that because as I was listening to you say, look, I thought I should look for magnesium. I thought I should be analyzing magnesium because I was
Mhm.
told it was magnesium, and then I discover it's 99, 0.99 silicon. Is that, okay, that happened because you didn't know what the problem was. The problem
Right.
fundamentally, I mean, the fundamental problem was, okay, how do you study a material which may be an effect of artifice, not nature?
Right.
And what are the questions then?
Right. And I don't even know that the silicon that I have, even measured at the atomic level, doesn't have an order that, because I'm measuring it with noise, doesn't have an order that actually has some function. And so there might be, with better understanding of how the atomic structure of this silicon is, I might understand something different about it, that it's not just your everyday silicon. So I still need to go another level deeper of analysis of that.
And that
So
just seems to me exemplary of what all the problems are going to be here, which
right,
is that we're so unfamiliar with the problem that we don't even know what the problem space is yet.
right,
And we talk as if we know. We talk
right.
as if, even the social and political problem of disclosure, we talk like we understand it. But
Hmm.
I think there are very few people that have even put their finger on the problem yet.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I think that's a great place to
Yeah.
stop. And
Yeah.
amazing conversation. And
Thank you. Yeah.
I
Same.
think you've given tons of food for thought to a lot of people. So that was great.
Yeah. Thanks.